Well, good evening, everybody. And welcome to you all, including those who are online in various countries around the world. On behalf of Cum Laude, the chairman of the Whitehall Group, and myself, you're all very welcome for the 11th lecture on the 10th anniversary of the series and the founding of the Cambridge University Land Society Whitehall Group. We are most grateful to Lord Sainsbury and the Institute for Government for hosting this event. In the last 10 years, we have had close to 200 meetings, lectures and seminars, all with distinguished speakers involving nearly 4,000 attendees, and we have published a lecture series and policy papers, and some of the lectures have been watched in over 13 different countries. The previous Whitehall lecture by Professor Philippe Sands was about human rights in the Chagos Islands, a precursor to his book in 2022 and the settlement by the UK government this year. I like to think that the lecture had a small part to play in that settlement. As a policy discussion forum for Cambridge alumni and their guests, we are indeed absolutely unique. If we look at the period since the Second World War and the fall of the USSR, have foreign policies of the Western powers failed to understand the cultures of the defeated and reawakening states? In the aftermath of the fall of Saddam Hussein, Rory Stewart writes, "We never understood how much Iraqis resented us, how much we were failing, and how humiliating and degrading our work had become. Our mission was a grotesque satire of every liberal aspiration for peace, growth, and democracy." How did we get it so wrong? Keynes was not about revenge or unaffordable retribution, which would humiliate the defeated party. What would he have said? In 2019, there was a major conference in Cambridge, England, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Keynes' The Economic Consequences of the Peace. And we are privileged this evening to have amongst our distinguished guests several of the authors of published papers following that conference. Professor Clavin writes in the opening lines of her and co-author's essay in the book published following the conference that the community of nations today is badly positioned to meet the existential threats it faces, in many ways resembling those faced by the world in 1919. And on Keynes' scathing account, it painted of a picture of what happens when enlightened multilateralism gives way to national rivalry and inward-looking electoral calculation. Not all agree that the resemblance is that strong, as the world today has materially changed. In her latest book, Anne Applebaum writes, "The 20th century image that there is a bad man at the top who controls everything is wrong. In the 21st century, autocracies are run by sophisticated networks relying on kleptocratic financial structures, a complex of security services and technological experts who provide surveillance, propaganda, and disinformation. These networks are connected to one another within a given autocracy, in other autocratic countries, and sometimes in democracies too." The relevance of Keynes will be the subject of discussion tonight. However, my question is that if there was a better understanding of cultures of those whom we feel threaten our democratic Western societies, and they of us, that we might be able to better defend and achieve a more harmonious world without launching into violent confrontation? In her recent book, Anthrovision, Dr. Tett, who studied social anthropology at Cambridge, as I did, writes, "Many of the tools we have been using to navigate the world are simply not working well. The problem is these tools are incomplete. They are used without an awareness of culture and context." Michael Pewitt, who is talking tonight on the panel, teaches about Confucian goodness, and he writes that Confucius tells that this is about the ability to respond well to others, the development of a sensibility that enables you to behave in ways that are good for those around you and draw out their own better sides. We know that autocratic states fail by this measure, but I think we in the West have failed also, and Keynes might possibly agree on many counts. Again, Professor Pewitt puts forward Lao Tzu philosophy that you can always defeat strength through weakness. Counterintuitively, he writes, if you're in a position of strength, play weakness. And if you are in a position of weakness, play weakness. If Netanyahu had reacted to the 7th of October massacre, had not reacted to the 7th of October massacre the way he has, if Putin had not reacted to the growth of NATO, of a defensive NATO as he has, given the threats we have to peace in the world today, is the biggest threat to democracy a re-elected Donald Trump? I invite Dr. Gillian, Tett, Provost of King's College, Cambridge, and Financial Times editorial board member, to give the 11th Whitehall lecture. Gillian.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed for that kind introduction. I didn't know that I was going to be proclaiming my views on Donald Trump, but I should congratulate you on the timing of this lecture, because there is a sense that we are hovering on the edge of a truly momentous crossroads in terms of where the world is going. And I should start off by saying that I feel quite intimidated talking to this extremely esteemed crowd and these academics about what I think is going on in the world, and very much invite dialogue and discussion. For those of you who don't know, I started off at Cambridge. I did a PhD in cultural anthropology there, not at King's, but at Clare College. I then went and spent the last 35 years working for the Financial Times, variously as a war reporter, economics reporter, then a Lex columnist, financial reporter. I ended up running the financial section, then running the American operations, and then being a chair of the editorial board of the FT in America. And I'm still with the FT as a columnist, but I spend half my time now, or over half my time, as Provost of King's College in Cambridge. So I come to look at the world from a variety of perspectives, both short-term, which is what most journalists tend to look at the world through the lens of, and I look at the sort of political economy through that perspective, but I also have the extraordinary privilege from my position at King's College of trying to look at the world through a longer lens of history. King's is 600 years old. As I'm very fond of pointing out to Americans, that makes us twice as old as America. We have an astonishing archive that I'm going to be drawing on tonight, and that affords us a bigger picture to try and make sense of what's happening in the world today. And the reason why I decided to focus on Keynes is that for those of you who, let me see if this works. Yes. Yeah. For those of you who follow the global political economy right now, you'll know that just at this very moment in Washington, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are having their annual meeting. And one of the key themes of this year's annual meeting is the fact that it's the 80th anniversary of the creation of Bretton Woods. And Bretton Woods, as all of you know, was very much driven, pioneered by Harry Dexter White, the American official, and John Maynard Keynes, the British envoy at the time. And looking back over the last 80 years, in many ways, the creation of that Bretton Woods institution system was a remarkable triumph. Kristalina Georgieva came up to Cambridge early this year to give a speech about the 80 years that she's been looking at of the Bretton Woods institutions, and pointed out that the spirit of collaboration and cooperation and attempt to build some element of mutual working together, at least in the Western world, has delivered remarkable trajectory of growth and progress for many parts of humanity in the last 80 years. So it's not surprising, given that we are currently hovering in a very dark potential moment of history, when we have not only an American election, which is infused with protectionism, populism, what might be called patriotism or nationalism, and all kinds of very dark displays of anger, at a time when you have right-wing forces erupting in Europe, at a time when you have Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, the Middle East disasters, and US and China increasingly at loggerheads. It's not surprising that people in Washington this week are desperately grasping at that 80-year-old anniversary and asking, how on earth can we repeat the experience of Bretton Woods? How can we rediscover that magic and that collaborative spirit? And in fact, a couple of weeks ago, the senior leaders of the IMF and World Bank met in the Bretton Woods Hotel to try and find ways to think about where they're going next. Here we are. They're going to be probably meeting in Cambridge early next year for the next round of that. So people are looking back to 1944 and asking, how and why do we recreate that spirit? But to my mind, the date that people should be thinking more about is not so much 1944, but 1919. Because the reason why Keynes fought so furiously for Bretton Woods and was so determined to try and build a collaborative spirit even before World War II had ended was very much informed by his memories of what had happened in 1919. And to my mind, that experience of 1919 has a lot of extremely sobering messages for us all. Now, if you mention 1919, people will tend to think about the economic consequences of the peace. I think that in many ways it is one of the most sobering and brilliant of the texts that Keynes wrote, not so much because of the second two-thirds of the book, which essentially descends into very detailed discussions of the economies of Europe and a lot of ad hominem attacks on a number of the people who were in the peace conference in 1919. And for those of you who haven't followed that period of history recently, essentially, Keynes went to Paris as part of the peace delegations post-World War I to try and forge some kind of peace deal plan forward in the ashes of World War I for the future. It took place in Paris. You had delegations from the US and the UK and elsewhere in continental Europe, and essentially they were trying to carve up the peace for the future. So much of the economic consequences of peace is about what happened in that conference. And frankly, reading it today, a lot of it sounds quite tedious, inside baseball, and not very relevant. But what's fascinating about the economic consequences of the peace is a picture he paints of his vision, and I stress his vision because it can be challenged in parts, and I suspect we will have challenges in a moment, but his vision of the story of what had happened in the decades before 1919. And I'm in the very privileged position of being able to both look at the economic consequences of the peace in 1919 documents and look at a number of papers that we have in the Keynes archive at King's College to see a bigger picture of what Keynes was trying to say in that book. And essentially, the key point to realize is that Keynes believed that the few decades before 1914, before the onset of World War I, were marked by a period of history which had seen the most remarkable explosion of, I'll come back to that in a moment, the most remarkable explosion of globalization, free market capitalism, and technological innovation that had been seen, he thought, at that point in the history of mankind. Essentially, what that meant was that in the decades before 1913, because of European imperialism, particularly British imperialism, you'd had this extraordinary flowering of global links, both in terms of the movements of goods, trade around the world, and in terms of the movement of people, because in those days, of course, you didn't need a passport to travel through much of the world, and in terms of the movements of capital. Really quite remarkable. I'll come forward. Oops. Come back to this moment. As he wrote, "What an extraordinary episode in the economic progress of man that age was, which came to an end in August 1914. Now, he admits that for many parts of the population, it wasn't as good as the elites thought it was, that many people were working extremely hard and living pretty tough lives. And in fact, one of the criticisms that you can have of what Keynes was writing about in those days, he tends to gloss over the extremely ugly face of imperialism that existed then. But his key point was that for upper middle class people in London, and he tended to focus on London, and since he was a man, he tended to assume that everyone was men at the time as well, that there were extraordinary benefits through that period that they had lived through. In fact, one of my favorite points that he says, which I believe we have, is that essentially a man in London could sit in his bed in the morning, pick up the telephone, and essentially dial in whatever he wanted to be delivered the next day on his doorstep. This was pre-Amazon. He then goes on and says that they can invest wherever they wanted, anywhere in the world, and enjoy the fruits of their investment, whether that is in a Brazilian mine or an Indonesian plantation or anything else. Global capital markets have become integrated in a way that's been very familiar to us in recent years, but was quite remarkable if you look back at what happened in the 19th century. And, as I say, even more remarkably, in those days, people could travel all around, for the most part, without a passport, without a visa, wherever their fancy took them. It was a period of intense globalization. Free market capitalism was driving much of it, and of course, they were also enjoying the fruits of tremendous technological innovation. Not AI, not ChatGPT, not the type of things that we worry about today. This was more about radio, electricity, things like that. But it was still the case that the combination of tech innovation, free market capitalism, and extreme globalization, rapid globalization, had, in Keynes's view, raised living standards really quite remarkably. And in fact, things were so good for the elite that, for the most part, insofar as people were suffering from imperialism, insofar as you had rising social tensions, insofar as you had increasing political splits emerging in Europe, these, for the most part, Keynes writes, were ignored by that elite. I love this comment, but basically it suggests that for the most part, all of these nasty, dark elements around the political economy, social and political conflict, they were treated just as fodder to liven up dinner party chatter or to be put on the front page of newspapers to sell more newspapers. People thought basically the dark side was kind of an amusement, entertainment, but the reality was that life, for the most part, was very good. And the other point that's remarkable, as Keynes writes, is that, we go back, there we go. Yeah. That, for the most part, people assumed that this state of affairs was going to continue indefinitely. There was an idea that history was essentially moving in a straight line towards more and more progress, and that was not just good, but inevitable and essentially unstoppable. And as Keynes points out, it's incredibly hard for people who are living in that environment to try to imagine a world where the entire system could fall apart, where history could suddenly go rapidly in reverse. Now, this particular quote comes from an essay that Keynes wrote well before he actually came out to Cambridge, well before 1913. We've got it in the archives, and it appears to date from 1902. And he's making that point, which is absolutely obvious to anthropologists, that we're all creatures of our own environment. We're all hardwired as human beings to assume that the world that we grew up in, the assumptions we absorb from our surroundings, are natural and inevitable and essentially unchanging, and that everyone else should have the same assumptions as us. That's one of the key elements in anthropology, pointing that out to everyone. And as part of that, as Keynes says, pre-1913, there was this assumption that it would continue almost indefinitely. And throughout his book, Economic Consequences of Peace, he keeps stressing over and over again that the power to become habituated to his surroundings is a marked characteristic of mankind. We all assume, inevitably, that what we've lived with will continue almost indefinitely. And what got him so upset in 1919 in Paris during negotiations was not just the fact that he felt that the negotiations were leading to a deeply unfair and potentially self-defeating situation for Germany, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But what also got him very upset was that, notwithstanding the fact that the world that people had assumed was unchanging and permanent in 1913, which had then fallen apart in 1914, when the elites gathered in 1919, there was an overwhelming tendency to assume that that had kind of been a bump on the road, but that things would pretty quickly go back to how they were pre-World War I, and that if people just stayed the course, somehow everything would magically revert to that path of globalization, capitalism, and innovation. And when he looked around at the discussions in Paris, what got him incredibly depressed was the level of blindness and the unwillingness to confront the idea that actually there might have been something very, very significantly changed in the environment, which meant that if they carried on with this revenge politics, which ruled the roost in 1919, that they would see a tremendous backlash. Now, what actually happened, as you probably all know, is that Keynes sat there in Paris for several weeks trying to negotiate. He frantically begged everyone not to create extraordinarily punitive conditions for Germany. His pleas fell on deaf ears, and eventually he resigned. And in fact, he wrote a wonderful letter to his mother as he on the day that he resigned, which we have in the archives, saying just how depressed he was. I've been utterly worn out, partly by work, partly by depression at the evil around me. He felt that the inability to realize just how complacent the elites had been before 1913 and how complacent they remained was essentially tantamount to profound evil. And he left Paris essentially predicting that if the Allies pressed ahead with the framework they were using and the conditions they were imposing on Germany, that it would inevitably not just bankrupt Germany, but sow such anger and resentment amongst the German population as a whole that it would almost inevitably lead to more conflict, more war, more disaster, and more reversals of the globalization that he thought had been so powerful and so beneficial pre-1913. Well, on one level, the rest is history, in the sense that Keynes turned out to be absolutely right. The framework that was posed in Germany after World War I did indeed turn out to be extremely punitive. It did indeed sow extraordinary resentment and anger, and of course it then paved the way, when coupled with the 1929 crash and depression, for the seeds of the conflicts that then erupted in the 1930s and led to World War II. But the reason why I find Keynes's description of that period so striking and in many ways so haunting for where we are today is that there are, in my view, extraordinary echoes of the position we find ourselves in right now. And the reason I say that is that back in 2007, on the eve of the great financial crisis, I went to Davos, the World Economic Forum, for the first time. And as someone who's trained as an anthropologist, I spent much of my life looking at large ritualistic gatherings. I did my PhD in Soviet Tajikistan looking at Tajik wedding rituals and trying to use an analysis of those rituals to explain essentially how the Tajiks were using symbolism and ritual to try and navigate the contradictions between being Muslim and communist, and also how they were using the rituals to create all these networks that essentially were so essential to their identity. And in many ways, a big tribal gathering like the World Economic Forum is very similar, because essentially what banking conferences, the World Economic Forum, or anything else does is act like a wedding ritual. You gather together a scattered tribe, you have a series of public, formal and informal rituals that try to recreate networks, and above all else, recreate a shared worldview, and recreate a sense of what seems to be natural, inevitable, normal, and unchanging. And just as Keynes observed, this idea that there are natural, unchanging, inevitable assumptions is something that, of course, is found in any social context. But as an anthropologist, one of the first things you do in any context, whether you're studying Tajikistan or the World Economic Forum, is to ask, what are the assumptions that bind people together? What do people assume is normal? And what do they not talk about? Because we often tend to not talk about our assumptions more than we talk about the things that actually come across our radar screen and are obvious. Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, who's very much been an intellectual lodestar for me, pointed out that what really matters in life is not what people talk about, but what they don't talk about, the social silences. And when I looked around in Davos back in 2007, what struck me back then was that essentially there were 4 key ideas which almost everyone in Davos essentially took for granted. And those were a belief in globalization being good and essentially unstoppable, a belief that free market capitalism was good and pretty unstoppable. I mean, there were shades of difference, but the idea that markets were good was pretty dominant. The idea that democracy was good and unstoppable was very much a dominant theme, had been ever since the 1989 collapse of the Berlin Wall. And the idea that technological innovation was good and unstoppable was also dominant. And yes, there were shades of difference. And no, people didn't really believe in the idea that history was dead, as Francis Fukuyama had once famously said. But there was the assumption that those 4 ideas were like the 4 legs of a table on which everyone was building their careers, and that essentially they would only spread and deepen across the world over time. There seemed to be an assumption that history was going in one line towards more and more progress. And in many ways, that seemed quite obvious because, as I say, the Soviet Union had collapsed, the Western vision appeared to have triumphed, and there was a feeling that living standards were rising, and for the most part, the world was fairly peaceful. I say fairly because, yes, I know there were conflicts, but it felt overall that the world was fairly peaceful. And the idea of another world war ever erupting seemed to be very, very hard to actually countenance or believe. Now, the story of what's happened since then is that one by one, those 4 pillars have gradually crumbled. I mean, if you start with the free market capitalism point, what you had a few months after I went to Davos in 2007 was the great financial crisis erupted that prompted governments to start intervening in the financial system in a way that would have been quite hard to imagine just 5-10 years earlier. And then central banks started intervening in money markets and setting the price of money, again with experiments like quantitative easing, which were unimaginable 10 years earlier. And then you start to move towards a period when you had essentially COVID and government intervention was cranked up again. Then you had Russia's invasion of Ukraine, energy markets and you had more government intervention. And bit by bit, we slid into a world where suddenly we have a situation in America today where both right and left candidates, both Republicans and Democrats, are talking about a level of government intervention under the banner of national security and, on the left, labor rights, which, again, was completely unimaginable a couple of decades ago. In fact, at this week's IMF World Bank meetings, a constant theme and refrain is the degree to which industrial policy has come back into vogue. And earlier this year, the IMF released a fascinating study which showed that in recent years, industrial policy measures have been rising. But for the most part, that used to happen primarily in emerging markets. And groups like the IMF would yell at emerging markets countries and tell them to reduce their industrial policy measures. Last year, industrial policy measures exploded across the world, and it was almost entirely due to developed countries adopting industrial policy measures, not emerging markets. The zeitgeist has shifted inexorably in quite a remarkable way. And then, if you think about democracy, well, Bertelsmann does a wonderful survey each year of democracy around the world, and it tracks about 130 countries. And what this shows is that 2004 was very much the high tide mark of democracy. Essentially, up until that point, you had more and more countries around the world becoming more democratic, and these measures were essentially going upwards. Since 2004, under almost every single measure, when they look at countries around the world, democracy has been backsliding. And Doug mentioned earlier Anne Applebaum's book. Her recent book in particular is very thought-provoking, because what she has is a very simple, very powerful message, which is that we all assumed post-1989 that over time, democracy would gradually crowd out autocracy. And democracy, Western democracy, would persuade autocratic countries to become more democratic. That was the overarching view. In fact, in the last few years, the reverse has started to happen, where autocrats are essentially crowding out democrats. And it's not just a case of some countries which were previously heading towards democracy becoming autocratic. It's that even in countries which are supposed to be banners of democracy, like America, there is increasing questioning of whether the democracy actually works or not. We're going to find this out in about 10 days, 2 weeks, about whether American democracy is working right now. And I'll just point out a couple of things. Firstly, the sheer volume of challenges that are now emerging in the law courts towards the democratic process means we probably won't even know for several days after the vote exactly who won. The fact you've got so many threats against election officials, the fact you've got so many people who are so scared of putting their head above the parapet right now is a sign of a democracy under pressure. And the fact you've actually got one of the candidates, namely Donald Trump, openly calling for retribution against those who try and defy him. The fact you actually have published lists of the officials they plan to go against. The fact that some of the people on those lists right now are thinking about their exit strategies and have been in touch with me is a sign of a democracy that, if nothing else, does not look particularly healthy right now. Then you have globalization. Well, globalization I find fascinating because when people toss around the word globalization, they tend to mean a number of different things. And to my mind, one of the best ways to think about globalization is to borrow the framework developed by NYU Stern in New York and the business school. And they break down globalization into 4 different parts. There's the movement of people, the movement of money, the movement of goods, and the movement of ideas. And if you break it down into those 4 parts, essentially what you can see is that overall, globalization is still just about going up, according to their index. And the reason is the movement of people obviously slowed down during COVID, but has since accelerated again. The movement of goods has indeed stalled as protectionism explodes, but it's not completely collapsed. I mean, trade has certainly not fallen off a cliff completely, or not yet. It may yet. One of the remarkable things the IMF did recently was try to model what would happen if the world split into two trading blocs that were based on the voting patterns in the United Nations after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Very roughly speaking, that would be the Western allies against what Washington used to call, half-jokingly, the axis of evil. Now they now call the axis of ill intent. So I think it sounds a bit less offensive. But the IMF actually modeled what would happen if the world split into those two trading blocs, what that would do to global GDP. And their analysis suggests that it could probably knock off up to 7% of global GDP if you had that complete trade fragmentation. And in this week's World Economic Outlook report, they actually extended that intellectual exercise and tried to look at what would happen if you had serious, significant tariffs imposed on trade of the sort that Donald Trump is now threatening. The numbers are a bit of a fiction, who the hell knows, but they again make the very obvious point that global growth would slow down quite significantly, including in America. But the good news is we're not actually at that point yet. Yes, trade growth has slowed down. Yes, you're seeing more intra-regional trade, but thus far, we do still have trade continuing. And so that measure of globalization is still ticking along. On the financial globalization, that's even more interesting right now. Post the 2008 crisis, it really fell off a cliff. It's then come back. But there's growing concern amongst a number of financiers about fragmentation of the capital markets. And in fact, those of you who read the FT yesterday would have seen Sergio Emotti, the head of UBS, writing about his real fears that we're seeing more and more fragmentation of global capital markets. But the thing that's really saved the overarching globalization metric has been the movement of ideas, because that has continued to explode via the internet in recent years. And as a result, as I say, globalization as a whole has not fallen off a cliff. And yet, the rhetoric we're seeing is increasingly alarming. If Keynes was here today, he would in many ways find it very, very familiar and very much an echo of what he saw in 1919 and beyond. Because no longer is globalization taken as a self-evidently good thing at all. On the contrary, the mood today, not just in America, but in much of Europe as well, is very much one of localization, patriotism, nationalism, protectionism, populism. I mean, in many ways, if you like, it started with Brexit, which was the first big squeal of rage against excessive globalization. And so, inch by inch, we have seen a whittling away of that pillar that we used to think was relatively normal. This is going back to my point about industrial policy measures, pretty self-explanatory. As you can see, it has exploded due to primarily the advanced economies, not the developed economies. And again, I just want to emphasize that this kind of pattern we almost take for granted now because there's so much drumbeat around industrial policies in the last year. 5-10 years ago, this would have been absolutely unimaginable. Ditto the subsidies. And the last one I find fascinating is around innovation. Again, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, innovation was tended to be seen as a self-evidently good thing. Then came the financial crisis, and suddenly financial innovation fell out of favor. Since then, we've seen backlashes against things like social media innovation. And what's really interesting today is that on the one hand, we have a race towards more and more innovation, and much of the elite tends to assume that it's very beneficial for everyone. All those incredible life sciences, all those amazing internet, AI, ChatGPT, all of those innovations that seem to be good. But if you look at things like the Edelman survey about attitudes towards innovation, what you can see is, first of all, a very clear split between different types of innovation. This is just one example where you can see that for the most part, green tech is accepted, GMO is definitely not, and AI and life sciences fall somewhere in between. But what's more important is that you also have a real split between what Edelman calls the elites, or the informed elites, and the wider population. Growing hostility and suspicion amongst the wider population towards not just some forms of innovation, but the experts who appear to be promoting these innovations. A growing lack of trust in authority figures around innovations. And in places like America, a growing distrust of science and scientific research, and a growing mood of anger towards those scientists. It's had some very interesting consequences. After Donald Trump was elected in 2016, for the first time in history, scientists were so horrified by the anti-science rhetoric around the Trump election campaign and the fact that the 2016 Congress had more talk show radio hosts in Congress than scientists, true fact, that they actually created for the first time ever a super PAC called 4013.org to try and fight for science debates in public. And they put out an appeal to scientists and asked for 1,000 of them to come forward in America and to actually stand for elected positions at all levels of America, ranging from school boards up to Congress. They thought they'd get 1,000. They actually had 7,000 volunteers almost immediately. Such was a sense of threat and horror among scientists about the way that the rhetoric was going. And in many ways, it's been a remarkably successful campaign in the sense that you've actually got a whole generation of scientists in America for the first time getting more engaged in public life and training people up to stand for office and have their voice heard. That's the good news. The bad news is that, unfortunately, here we are in 2024, and once again, we're seeing an explosion of rhetoric in America on the right, but not exclusively on the right, essentially challenging innovation, challenging science, and challenging authority. Whether it's Bobby Kennedy Jr. essentially saying that he doesn't believe in the vaccines, whether it's the fact that you actually have in Florida a significant proportion of the population saying they do not believe in climate change, even though they've just lived through repeated hurricanes. I mean, one, again, a little tiny fact is that the level of climate change denial in Florida is considerably higher than in the northeast of America right now. Time and again, you're seeing people rejecting science, rejecting innovation as part of a modernity they do not like. Again, it's an image which would have been very hard to imagine a few years ago. So my key point is that just as Keynes in 1919 was convulsed with depression about the fact that pre-1914 you had an elites who assumed that back then globalization, free market capitalism, and innovation were good and would continue, and then failed to learn the lesson in 1919 that they needed to stand up and fight for those values rather than just engage in populism, protectionism, and punitive measures. Today, we're living in a period of time when most of us have built our careers on those four legs of a table and assumed until very recently that it would continue almost indefinitely. In fact, if you were to ask most people around you today, do you think that what we're living through with the rise of populism, the American election, with some of the ugly displays of protectionism we're seeing all over the Western world, do you think that means that we're now living in a radically different world from what we grew up with? Most of us probably are still tempted to assume that it's a bump on the road, but somehow, sooner or later, we will simply go back to where we were 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It's really hard for humans to assume or to understand that the zeitgeist has changed. But the key point I want to make is this. I don't know whether we're living through 1919 or 1944 right now. I don't know whether the leaders of politics and business, civil society, are going to stand up, as they did in 1944, and say, actually, we need to stand up and fight for a better world, for more globalization, for innovation to be accepted, and for the free market system and democracy to be dominant values. Maybe we are living, as the IMF so desperately hopes, on the edge of a rebirth of that collaborative spirit. Maybe the shock of what's happened in America in recent years, what we're seeing in the European continent, maybe the shock of the fragmentation in the Middle East and the bloody and brutal tragedies there, and what we're seeing around Ukraine, will actually wake us all up and get us to stand up and fight for the values that have underpinned so much of our world in recent years. Or maybe we're back, as Keynes lamented in 1919, in a very complacent spirit, a mood of punitive anger, of populism, of punishing each other, and that's going to take us down a very dark path. One of the things I find fascinating, which complicates the picture today, is that when Keynes was writing his desperate appeal in 1919 in the economic consequences of the piece, he took it for granted that if anyone was going to shape the destiny of the West, it was going to be the elites. He talked a lot about the elites. He wrote about the elites. As I say, he tended to ignore the women. He tended to ignore people who were not upper middle class living in London. But there was an assumption back then that there was so much trust in authority figures, there was so much respect for hierarchies and in institutions, that it would be the elites who actually shaped where the world went. Today, we live in a very different world. I mean, two of the consequences of the innovation known as the internet and social media today are that our patterns of trust and our sense of the relationship between the self and society has shifted quite deeply. I put this photo up because when people think about cell phones today, they often think about things like, distraction, attention disorders, about all the evil sides of social media and things like that. That's very significant as part of the shifts that cell phones have ushered in. To my mind, though, some of the most important shifts that cell phones have ushered in is firstly a shift in trust patterns away from trust in authority figures to increasingly trust in the peer group on digital platforms. The reason I say that is because anthropologists like me used to be taught that there were two types of trust that underpin society. You either had peer-to-peer horizontal trust in small groups, or when groups became too big, that was basically replaced by trust in authority figures and institutions. But cell phones have now introduced, for the first time in history, an ability to have distributed trust, peer-to-peer trust, on a massive scale. You can see that if you ask yourself, why do you get into an Uber, a stranger's car, without fear? Because essentially you trust the peer rating system you have for Uber drivers and the scrutiny that that can create. And at the same time, you've also had a shift towards a world where people increasingly assume that by virtue of their cell phones, that they have the right to customize the world around them to their tastes. People are increasingly customizing not just their consumer choices, but their identities, their news sources, their affiliations. And that's allowing them increasingly to cluster into small self-defining groups online. And when you put those two elements together, what you have are increasing echo chambers online and a world where the idea of the elites fighting for the future and defining where we're going increasingly looks out of step with where we are today. Insofar as a political energy is going to redefine our world going forward, it's as much about peer-to-peer groups, about distributed trust, about our cell phone social media culture as anything else. And how that will play out in the world today in terms of where we go with globalization, capitalism, democracy is very unclear. But I read Keynes's book, Economic Consequences piece, as a warning. I don't think we can get to that sunny vision of 1944 without recognizing the shock and the tragedy of 1919. And the question for me today is, can we recreate that collaborative spirit after World War II without making the same mistakes that came before that Keynes lived through as well? I hope we can, but we only can if we all work together and learn the right lessons. So on that note, I'll stop, and I will hear from the real history experts about whether I'm right, wrong, whether we have reason to be optimistic or pessimistic, and how we can work together. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed, Gillian. There was a lot there to think about and unpick. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Gemma Tett, Chief Economist here at the Institute for Government. I'm going to moderate this part of the event. I'm really pleased, as Gillian has already alluded to, that we're now joined by 3 expert additional panellists who will first provide some brief reactions to Gillian's remarks, and then we'll come to audience questions as well. So just to introduce the new panellists, we have Professor Michael Pewitt, who has very kindly travelled all the way from Harvard to be with us this evening. So thank you very much for that, Michael. Michael is Walter C. Klein Professor of Chinese History and Anthropology and the Director of the Asia Centre at Harvard University. His interests are focused on the interrelations between history, anthropology, religion and philosophy, and the hope of bringing the study of China into larger historical and comparative frameworks. We also have Professor Patricia Clavin, who is Professor of Modern History at Worcester College, Oxford. Professor Clavin's work centres on the history of Europe's transnational and international relations from 1850. She's especially interested in the relationship between states, civil society and markets, both internationally and nationally. And finally, we have Sir Laurie Bristow, who is now President of Hughes Hall, Cambridge, but was previously the UK's ambassador to Afghanistan and Russia, among other places. So all bringing really interesting perspectives to this question. Michael, let me start with you.
I'll be honored to. So let me begin by saying I'm so honored to be here with the Whitehall group, and so honored too to be speaking in response to Gillian's just outstanding vision. As you undoubtedly know from her work, part of what makes Gillian so extraordinary is she is an anthropologist and brings that anthropological lens to rethinking world history, rethinking current events, rethinking longer patterns, and you've seen that beautifully today. So thank you so much. I think the vision you have given us is sadly very convincing, and I do agree. We are at a moment that is indeed very comparable to what Keynes was facing right after World War I, and I do fear the trajectory is moving towards something very, very comparable to those next few decades, and I think that is a very, very likely scenario. I'm coming from America, and I do believe the worst tendencies that you mentioned are absolutely playing out and could play out in very strong forms in just a couple of weeks. So sadly, I am in full agreement with your analysis, and therefore in full agreement with the spirit of them, which is to say we need to, if we care about these values, fight. Now, it might seem like an odd thing for me to say, given what I've just mentioned, that I'm going to make things first a little darker, but I'm going to, because if we are going to fight for these issues, we do have a larger set of concerns than even Keynes had to face. Keynes was largely looking at a world of the UK and Europe. This was, of course, a global world, but he was not terribly concerned with it. That has now changed. And let me say a few words about how all of the key issues Gillian has been talking about have been and are currently playing out in China. Because China is, although it's often portrayed, especially in America, as simply an example of an autocratic government, and there's lots of reasons why it's portrayed that way, there's much more going on, and much more going on in its critique of American forms of globalization that may very well play out significantly in the decades to come. So let me take my few minutes just to say a few words about this. So first of all, I'm going back not too far, a little bit later I'll go a little bit farther back in time, but going back simply to the 1990s in China. In the 1990s in China, you have an all-out embrace of one aspect of the key issues Gillian has been mentioning, namely neoliberal globalization. So China absolutely embraced this, not across the board, but it opened up significant parts of its economy to the globalized order. The results, as is well known, were extraordinary from an economic viewpoint, looking at the indicators of things like GNP, et cetera. So you have extraordinary economic growth. That continues well into the early 2000s. This would look from the outside absolutely wonderful. However, what was often being missed is the level of discontent that was growing in China, because China was now facing an extraordinary wealth inequality. You had a very, very wealthy elite, billionaires for the first time, in a few of the key cities and coastal areas of China. You had a radical, if anything, harm being done to the rest of the country, where actually you have a growing poverty level, especially in the rural areas. You have an extremely strong discontent arising, which not surprisingly results in the emergence of course, the movements that we know, but I'd like to say a couple of quick words about them. So when the critique emerges, it emerges in the form of and this is very intriguing, leftist critique of American neoliberalism. The two main figures were, one, his name was Bo Xilai, who overtly modeled himself on Mao. So he would say, I am standing up to American neoliberalism. And you'd wake up in the mornings of Chongqing and there would be a picture of Bo Xilai having raided a bank during the middle of the night, saying, I'm taking back the wealth back to the people, ending the corporate control over our economy, ending the corporate control over our government, stopping China from becoming another America. I am saving the people. And then he would have huge parades, literally modeled on Cultural Revolution parades. So presenting himself as a Mao reincarnated, critiquing and standing against American neoliberalism. There was another figure, part of that same leftist critique that you probably have heard of, named Xi Jinping. And unlike Bo Xilai, Xi Jinping was hardly a charismatic figure. No one would have mistaken him for a charismatic Mao whatsoever. However, Xi Jinping was and is still, an incredibly savvy politician. And he, unlike Bo Xilai, maneuvered himself, of course, into the highest position and maneuvered Bo Xilai into lifelong imprisonment. And the key move for Xi Jinping is he realized, I will play up the Mao side, which he did and still actively does, but I will mix it with, of all things, a claim to recreate the great imperial system of China based upon a meritocratic bureaucracy that will be able to oversee the economy, that will be able to deal with wealth inequality, and ultimately be able to propel China into a great power, eventually becoming the great power in the world, as it once had been, according to this narrative, and overthrowing the American imperial order. The key thing for that last statement was the claim, very strongly made repeatedly, was that, yes, since 1944, there had been a United Nations created based upon, as the name correctly implies, the argument that the world was divided into nation states and the UN would be a union of those nation states. That actually was not the object of Xi Jinping's critique. The critique was that then in the 1990s, America had de facto destroyed this by recreating the British empire. So the British Empire, from this narrative, was precisely the globalization pre-1949, I'm sorry, pre-1914, very telling Freudian slip, that created the globalization that Keynes was talking about, and that, of course, also that same world led to a colonization of much of the world. China wasn't colonized, but significant parts of it were cut off. And the claim is America is redoing it. So they're breaking the United Nations, they're breaking the nation-state system, they are recreating a globalized neoliberal order, but it's really just an American empire. And nation-states are losing their power. China has lost all of its power. That's why we have come to be controlled by American neoliberal concerns. That is what I, Xi Jinping, am standing up against. So in other words, the critique was explicitly against globalization, absolutely, certainly against democracy, absolutely, but it was all about breaking down wealth inequality, managing an extraordinary economic growth, but managing it without the wealth inequality, aimed at rebuilding a global order. And for the latter, this of course is why China launches this huge global vision called known as the Belt and Road Initiative, trying to recreate a trade system on massive infrastructural development, exactly what the WTO was saying you're not allowed to do anymore, saying we are going to take a developmental model, but it's not a developmental model, it's a China model, and we will recreate a new global order that will be breaking the 1990s and post American neoliberal order. And it also will be, getting to the fourth point of Gillian's wonderful talk, absolutely committed to radical innovation, because unlike the American is always the object of critique in Xi Jinping's rhetoric, we will throw our money into GMOs, AI, reworking fetuses in the womb as our technologies allow us to, and we can do it because we will have a meritocratic bureaucracy that will run things as opposed to religious beliefs that will limit what we can do. I mention all of this for the following reason. When in America, there is this view that it is a question of democracies versus autocracies, and China is, of course, an autocracy along with Russia and Iran, etc. What this misses, in fact, is that you have an incredibly powerful critique of American neoliberalism that you see strongly in China, but hardly only in China. I mean, you can see this globally, but China sees itself, and at the moment, relatively successfully, as the leader of this. It is aimed at an all-out critique, not of the UN system, but of that system of globalization associated with the British Empire. Now they would claim the American Empire. They, in China, see themselves as very different from Russia. They're temporary allies, but the view is Russia is very different. That's autocratic. That's not a meritocratic bureaucracy. That's not a return to a grand imperial system that's somehow also Maoist. The view is we in China are going to create a radically different order by recreating the best things that existed in the imperial past in East Asia. Now, will this succeed? At the moment, the economy is doing horribly in China. There's a tremendous discontent about Xi Jinping. There's a strong feeling he's overplayed his hands. So how this will play out with Xi Jinping, very unclear. However, will this vision in China after Xi Jinping leaves the stage continue? Quite plausibly. How will that play out with all of these other things playing out in the world? The rise of Trump, Putin, etc., is going to lead things to be, well, very different. I won't say better or worse, because it's going to be horrible regardless, but very different from the world that Keynes was accurately foreseeing. And I would simply like to conclude by saying this is going to add another element that I think, at least in America, is utterly misunderstood. The foreign policy establishment does not see what is going on in China. Its reactions to China could not be worse in terms of creating the worst possible scenario. And if this isn't added to our list of things to start really, really rethinking, if we thought the world after World War I, those next few decades was bad, well, let's just say we need to be very, very worried, and we need to be, as Gillian has said, anthropologists who really can start understanding these trajectories and start working with and shifting these trajectories, or we are going in a very dangerous direction. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I feel like I need to say something cheering, but I'm not I'm going to after that, Michael.
So sorry.
No. Thank you, Gillian. I think I'm with Michael in the sense that we're in a very much more 1919 than 1945 moment. The thing that really distinguished that 1945 moment with Bretton Woods, but also with the United States standing as the arsenal for democracy in the Second World War, and the commitment to burden sharing that was part of that effort to reconstruct Europe and then also to build these international institutions, both the UN, the Bretton Woods, and then the kind of 96 institutions that follow with it. What makes 1919, and Michael is also alluding to the kind of deep historical pathways, so much like now, is partly the multiplicity of different challenges that we face, the multipolar world that was so evident in 1919 and that Keynes was responding to. And there's a paradox in a way where Michael ended up that I wanted to point to first, which is that in 1919, of course, the world seemed to fail, and that was also part of the bit of the text that, is always uncomfortable reading, the way that he really lays into Woodrow Wilson in a way that's, really quite unfair. Is that this is the failure of the United States to stand by its commitments to the Paris peace, and it realizes on that promise in 1940 when it enters the war against Japan and Europe at the same time, and then helps build the New World Order after 1945. But that comes with this other side of the history story, which is, of course, the world economy is stabilized through British hegemony in the 19th century. It's the American century in the 20th century, and then the 21st century is the China century. And that is a trap, I think, that you were kind of alluding to in the background of your story. And that's the more positive part, really, of what I want to say about this being like the 1920s, but not yet the 1930s, which is that when the kind of the UN institutions and Bretton Woods does come out of this very deep experience of the history of the 20s and 30s, not just from Keynes's pivotal position with Hayden White, but also through all of the institutions that were built, the International Chamber for Commerce, the Bank of International Settlements, the League, which gave you the ideas and the practices and many of the people that populated these institutions. So there are deep historical pathways in our institutions. There's also a body of international law. Part of that is conflicted and problematic at the top end, but it's also what I think is partly keeping those levers of international trade and arbitration going on underneath. The way that we, in a way, see this story as one of US and British hegemony is partly is true in the sense that they had the capital, they helped build some of these international laws, but it's also true that there are small states and there are other actors that make the international system work. And it's important to remember that in these institutions, it was certainly true of the League. I mean, it's a kind of classic GCSE subject that everybody thought the League of Nations failed, but but we got war. But the idea was really there wasn't an expectation that you'd get rid of conflict, but rather that you would agree the rules on which conflict would take place. And in that sense, we have at the moment, we're still in that world. The difference to the League system, the challenge that posed existentially, and that challenge also, I mean, I'm with Michael a little bit, in the moment it actually looks like the challenge is coming from the United States more than from China, is when the League of Nations, when Germany leaves the League and actually has a completely different vision of what global order should look like. Japan and Italy, interestingly, stay inside and contest the system from within because some of the laws and some of the outcomes of the peace seem so fundamentally unfair. I mean, Keynes is talking about reparations and actually the attempt to make Germany, Austria and Hungary pay for reconstruction. So that's part of the issue. But there's also, of course, and this is really in a way where Keynes is quite interesting and not clear, it's your point about elites, the response to self-determination, which is a big democratic idea, but it means that, of course, self-determining states also have the right to put protection around their national economies, and the countries that do that are in Central and Eastern Europe. So you have this paradox of this becoming a really atomized world, and Britain and the United States forcing, they strip away from Germany, Austria and Hungary any right to protect their own economies while reserving the right to do that for themselves. So you kind of create ultimately a vision of a Europe that's open and closed, and that's sort of what the international system looks like, and that's partly the reaction against it, and China's deep reaction to the idea that the Japanese posited, well, we want a racial equality clause, and the British and the Americans go, oh no, we can't possibly give you that. So China's assault is it goes back to that 1919 moment, not really, but it's inside the system after 1945. So this is, I think, what's also quite difficult to understand from the 1945 moment, which is so iconic to us in the West, because it did rebuild, will rebuild the West and certainly rebuild Europe after 2 world wars. But in Asia, that was where it went wrong. And actually 1919 was the point where it could have actually been a much more effective, equal multilateral world, but you had international institutions and international law which had these ambiguities inside them. I think I'll stop there, Gemma, and then let the others, Thank you.
Fascinating.
Thank you very much. Finally, Laurie.
Thank you. Well, I wish I could be more optimistic than the two previous speakers. Earlier this year, I was involved in a briefing session for some politicians, where essentially the task was to give a sort of tour d'horizon of what was going to be facing them in the coming years. The feedback after giving my presentation on Russia and the war in Ukraine was in exactly these words: you don't have a great future as a motivational speaker. So I will do my best. But I think running through this conversation, it's kind of Gillian's challenge to us. What is there to be optimistic about? What is there to hold on to in all of this? There's any number of things I wanted to pick up from your talk, Gillian. But before I do that, I think it's just worth starting with a point that you made towards the end about a bump in the road. It's a pretty big bump in the road. We have a major high-intensity war in the middle of Europe right now, 2 hours flying time from here. That is something that we have not seen since the 1940s, and none of us expected to see in our lifetimes. But that's what we've got. I think probably as a practitioner, my starting point really needs to be the question that all policymakers and practitioners are facing now: how does this war end? How do wars end? And the related question of why do they start? And just at the risk of grossly overgeneralizing here, wars start essentially because there is a conflict or a perceived conflict of interests that cannot be managed or put off. And that at least one party to that war believes there's more to gain from fighting than from not fighting. How wars end, essentially, is when either the reverse of that happens or one side loses. And that, I think, is the really big challenge for 2025. Of course, the big moving part here is the US election. It's not difficult to map out 2 alternative worlds. Alternative world 1 is that the rug is pulled out from under the Ukrainians. As you'll have seen from my CV, I know roughly what that looks like. It's the Doha Agreement with the Taliban. That was the rug being pulled out from under the government, under the state, under the nation that we supported at huge cost for 20 years. And essentially what the Doha Agreement did was walk away from the problem. Alternative 2 is that the incoming administration goes along with the current position, but probably does too little, too late, and too risk-averse, actually to avoid a situation where you are in a war of attrition, and the feature of a war of attrition is that it essentially becomes about who loses fastest on any of the key axes, whether it's territory, the ability to generate force, the ability to just having enough people to fight the war, but also having the support of the public behind you to continue with this misery to which there is no end in sight. So, before I come back to what I think what that means for 2025, I just wanted to pick up 4 things from what Gillian said that I think there's a book in each of them, at least, from at least all of us, and probably most of the room as well. One is around the role of, broadly speaking, emotion in these things. Over the years, I've become really fascinated by studying a man like Vladimir Putin. You don't need to speak Russian or understand Russian to understand what's motivating him. You can see the anger, the resentment, the fear, the bitterness that crackles out of him when he speaks. And I said something in a Whitehall meeting about 10 years ago, which people still play back to me, rather embarrassingly. If you want to know what he's thinking, listen to what he's saying. You will not like it, but that's what he thinks. It's not the same thing as telling you what he'll do, that's another thing altogether. But listen to what he's saying. That gives you a pretty clear steer to what his motivations will be and therefore what he will do. Second, complacency and cognitive biases. We've all got them, but I think those of us who've worked in government have learned really the hard way over recent years how dangerous things like optimism bias, confirmation bias are. Wishing that the world is as you would like it to be, not as it actually is. And I think that's one of the things, again, that's rung through what you've been talking about this evening, Gillian. Linked to that, what people don't talk about, the insight of the anthropologist. People don't talk about things quite often because they are too challenging to contemplate. We don't talk much about what would happen if Ukraine lost the war, because it is too horrifying to contemplate. We need to face up to the consequences of people's decisions, including ours, but there's a mirror image to this. The people in the Kremlin as well do not talk about the things. I know I've had these conversations with them. They don't like to talk about the things that they don't like to contemplate. The effect on Russia of the path that they've chosen over time. Over time, Russia is cannibalizing itself. It doesn't help us in the short term. It doesn't help them in the long term. But it's a kind of fact unfolding before us now, which will determine and shape choices made for after the fighting stops. On the last one, it's about, you described it as the movement of ideas. I would describe it as the movement of bad ideas, rubbish thinking and magical thinking. It is one of the great challenges, I think, of our age and of our generation. For those who are still on Twitter, X, I'm afraid I still am, for reasons I'll explain, there's something odd happening. My feed, my timeline in the last 2 months, it may just be me, it is a torrent of Russian trolls. I'm used to that, but those for a decade or more. It is the wisdom of Nigel Farage. I don't follow Nigel Farage, but I get it every day. It is a series of very, very well produced and executed, but blatant Chinese propaganda. It's coming at me with a fire hose. And of course, because I'm interested in this stuff, I read it and I get more, and it multiplies. So I mean, the point here is about the way that the algorithms work to embed bad, rubbish, magical thinking. So, on to how this ends. So look, there's a lot of talk now about Mr. Zelensky's victory plan. I think it's better understood now as a survival plan. Of course, he has to talk about it as a victory plan. But we're going into a very, very difficult year. You can see it in the basic facts of this conflict. A lot of talk about a negotiated peace. Negotiated peace is, in my view, an example of magical thinking. There is no negotiated peace with Mr. Putin. I can quite see a ceasefire, but that's not the same thing. And here the point that we need to understand is that dealing with Mr. Putin and the people like him in the Kremlin now, land for peace, well, land for a kind of peace, but you need to understand what kind of peace. It's a peace where essentially Russia rearms, regroups, continues sub-threshold warfare, and waits for us to get bored and focus on the next thing. I've come to think of this as a kind of reverse Clausewitz. I mean, we all tend to think, we pick up the quote as, war is the continuation of politics by other means. The world we are now in, with Mr. Putin, is politics as the continuation of war by other means. We may not like it, but we have to understand it, and we have to behave accordingly. Negotiations. I think it follows from what I've said that there is not going to be a stable peace while Mr. Putin is in office. Mr. Putin will be in office until he dies, and what happens after that, I think, will be a very messy transition. And what will be at the end of that transition will almost certainly not be democracy. So then you're into the world that Keynes was struggling with in 1919. What on earth do you do with that? I don't have a good answer other than recognize that that is the world we're going into. And my final point is, what does that mean for us? It means that we're going into a world where the transatlantic relationship is A, fundamental, and B, very, very troubled, regardless of who is in the White House next, for a number of really objective reasons, and they're not all to do with Mr. Trump, to be honest. Second, I think the real negotiation here, at least in the coming year or so, is not actually with Russia. It's between Ukraine and its Western supporters and within the West itself, as to what we are prepared to do to guarantee security, Ukraine's security and our security. And the point about security guarantees, that they are security guarantees for Ukraine, not security guarantees for Russia. And they are only worth two things. Can you do it, and do you mean it?
Thank you very much. So we'll now come to audience questions. For people watching online, unfortunately, no questions seem to be coming through on my devices. This is a technical glitch. Perhaps somebody can help me. If not, then hopefully we'll get to your questions in a bit. But we'll start with people in the room. I'll take a group of 3 questions, and then we'll respond. So we'll take Lord Howard first. Sorry, do you mind if you take the microphone, then people watching online can hear you as well?
Thank you, and thank you all for a very stimulating, if rather depressing, evening. Isn't it reasonable to regard the China, as described by Professor Pewitt, as an existential threat to the West in general and the United States in particular? And if that's the case, isn't it reasonable for an American administration, even if it adheres to the theoretical advantages of free trade, and I'm not sure either of the current presidential candidates do, to take protectionist measures to protect its citizens from dependence on China for goods and services which are critical to their well-being?
Thank you. And actually, we'll take the question right next to you, and then we'll come over there as well.
Can I pursue the world of ideas? Gillian didn't push that as part of the Keynes story from 1919 to 1945. I think it was central, and I just want to add that to the mix. What he saw was a collapse of the world order for reasons which he struggled to understand until basically the production of the general theory in 1936 to establish macroeconomic failure. And beyond that, with his colleagues, to create, and with Harry Dexter White in an extraordinary negotiation, to understand the ideas necessary to build a global order with an IMF, a World Bank, a World Trade Organization, for recognizable problems for which these institutions were solutions. And the analytical underpinning of the general theory was that Marshall's economics about competitive, simple capitalism produced a world in which you could have unemployment. It seems to me that the world that Gillian and the others of you have described faces an intellectual, existential failure of a very similar kind that's different. That was unregulated capitalism produces a Great Depression. Our story is that unregulated capitalism isn't Marshallian perfect competition. It's brutal oligopolistic competition. And my discipline, economics, has no good means of analysing this. And until we do, we cannot answer your question, because answering your question must allow latitude for behaving in ways that the World Trade Organization believes that it will not and should not tolerate. And until we are in the world of ideas, find a way of underpinning a world order which allows the kind of things that you describe as necessary, and yet prevents brutal capitalist rivalry of a kind which we know from the 30s can, in its own way, lead to war, we haven't yet got the idea structure we need for the world order we're trying to build. And you can see me trying to make using Keynes as my framework, a parallel. This needed a new idea about the failure of the economistic system which he inherited. And I believe we're in the same position now. And that in some important way, until my discipline wakes up to the need to how to construct this, all of the other things that have been described on the panel will come back to haunt us all the time. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll take a third question over here. Please do say who you are, particularly for the benefit of people online, so that everyone knows.
My name is Professor Michael Cox. I'm from the London School of Economics, and I was given the job 10 years ago, thereabouts, to write an introduction to the book you're talking about today. Why they would give it to somebody from the LSE or not Cambridge, I don't know, but they did. And so all the letters you were quoting from, Gillian, I've read them, many of them to his mother in particular, are great. It's a great book, but it's deeply unfair as a book. I mean, his diatribes against poor old Wilson are very tough.
Yeah.
And to call one of the greatest prime ministers of the 20th century, David Lloyd George, a goat, I thought was seriously unfair, both on David Lloyd George and indeed on the great nation of Wales. But I just want to ask the question to you, Gillian. Is it 1919 or 1945, or is it neither? I mean, you know, I remember a great article written once by Walt Rostow, controversial historian, as you know, and strategist, said, beware historians bearing false historical analogies. Now, I'm not saying you're drawing in that kind of crude reductionist way, but I wonder if we've got to analyse 224 in its own terms. And we might, therefore, you know, draw from 1919 and certainly draw from the warnings of dear old JMK, but I just wonder sometimes what lessons should we be drawing or not? And can I introduce a little bit of LSE optimism into the evening's proceedings, perhaps? Because otherwise we'll all go home and drink very large amounts of gin and tonic if you can afford it. I mean, firstly, Gillian, you yourself said that globalization is still going. You know, I know there's all sorts of problems in it, de-risking, but it's still going. It's under stress, and China still buys into it. Oh, sure. It may be the problem you talked about, Michael, but nonetheless, it's still buying into it.
Oh, absolutely.
We need to throw that into the conversation. Democracy, I agree with you, is all over the place, but we've had 64 elections this year. Some of them may have been deeply imperfect, but they still were held, beginning in Taiwan and running through a whole bunch of other countries like Indonesia, South Africa. And by the way, and this comes to Keynes, and I will end here, I won't go on for too long, Europe is holding. Okay, it's got its problems, it's got its renegades, it's got the guys we don't like, but it's got a lot of guys we do like. And when Keynes was writing, Europe was on the process of fragmentation and total disintegration. And it ain't like that at the moment. There's a genuine threat to it, and I agree with what was said by Sir Laurie Bristow on the Ukraine war, but nonetheless, still, Europe holds, in spite of the British getting out. If anything, Brexit makes Europe even more united, because they don't want to go through the horror stories that this country had to go through after 2016, were almost the best argument there could be for keeping Europe together. So there may be some grounds for optimism from your talk, and I hope you don't mind the LSE intervening into this Cambridge affair, but I thought I'd better say something. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Gillian, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that optimism point and say there is an optimistic reading of what's going on right now. It's possible, if you go back to the four sort of, you know, key themes that I highlighted, you could say, well, actually, in reaction to what's happening. We may get a capitalism which is fairer and more inclusive and less extractive and less exploitative. And one way to make sense of what's happened with the rise of the ESG movement and stakeholderism is that that's exactly what is slowly emerging. It's possible to say that, out of the at least rhetorical backlash against globalization, you're getting more localization, more of a sense of community. David Goodhart has written a lot about this, and that will again be something which voters like more. And as you say, globalization is not dead, but it's certainly under rhetorical attack and under protectionism and attack from war. You could say, well, actually on the innovation side, it's good that people are questioning innovation and science, because we don't necessarily want to have mad scientists running everything and mad financiers doing financial innovation left, right and centre, and more questioning and debate is worthwhile. And equally, you can say, well, actually, on the democracy side, the fact that parts of Europe have flirted with the far right and are now stepping back, the fact that Britain had a populist prime minister for 3 years and has now rejected him and is now making a virtue out of being stunningly boring, and suddenly boring technocratic government looks rather attractive given what's happening elsewhere on the world stage. The fact that Poland rejected the most populist type of option is all encouraging. So maybe, just maybe, by the end of this year, we will see that having flirted with extreme populism and protectionism, that the world has come to its senses and decided to follow Britain by embracing boring governments. Certainly that is a bet that Kamala Harris's team are making, because if you look at, I often say that the Harris-Trump fight is less about policies, it's more about dueling memes, and the Trump team have the meme of anger and hate. And the Harris team appear to be betting that after 8 years of endless anger and hate, Americans are getting bored of that and ready for a bit of hope and joy. And one reason why Chicago was so suffused with hope and joy memes is because parts of the Harris team think it's time for a change. So it's possible that in a month's time, the election will surprise us all, and we will discover that hope and joy have triumphed, and the negativity we've lived with for the last couple of years will have served to wake us up and realize that we can take these values and craft a better option, better future, and do so, hopefully, with China. That is my very, very fervent hope. I wish I was 100% confident that's how it's going to play out, but that is indeed what I'd like to see.
Do you want to pick up on any of the other questions?
On the China, no, the China thing is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And I think that it does add an element of complexity to where we are. And by the way, I should say that, I'm not in any way meaning to use the 1919, 1944 options as a crude historical, it's more just to make the point very simply that this is not the first time that history's gone into reverse and we've gone backwards. It's really not. And that, for many people, is something which is not obvious at all. And I think, as you say, China makes it considerably worse. Yes. And by the way, I completely agree with Laurie on Ukraine. I've been going back and forth to Ukraine quite a bit in the last couple of years, which is something you probably can't do, and in your role. And I am horrified by what is unfolding there now, and I desperately hope that my worst fears are not going to be realised.
Michael, shall I come to you next? Do you want to take on Lord Howard's question about his US right to respond to China?
Oh, I'd love to. And let me just thank all three questioners. I found all three questions wonderful in themselves, and also they worked incredibly well together, even though the hands were in random. So I'll pick up on things actually from all of them, but going in reverse order, if that's okay, and actually building on Gillian's optimism, because I think there is a thread of optimism here. So I fully agree with the point that China does not represent an attack on globalization. And I think you're absolutely right. This is crucial. So China is often thought of in America as representing this radical building of national borders, battling against globalization. As you said, it's actually very different. Actually, the argument that's very strong in China now is globalization was wonderful beginning in 1945 and wonderful right through the mid-90s, the beginning of the so-called Washington Consensus, that China sees itself as mistakenly buying too much into. And the mistake that's perceived to be dominant in China is we bought into the WTO, we bought into this idea that states have to be basically devastated, that you cannot build massive bureaucracies, you cannot build massive infrastructure projects, that corporations need to be given basically free rein. Laissez-faire capitalism is the only way to build a global system. And China's view is we mistakenly bought into that, and that was wrong because, again, that was, as I mentioned, really just an American imperial vision. It wasn't even a global vision. And very much the claim is we are going to build a better global order. And we will strongly emphasize the importance of states, the importance of meritocracy, the importance of huge infrastructure projects. The entire Belt and Road Initiative is basically saying we're going to build a different global order than the American-led neoliberalism beginning in the 1990s. So very much they are in favor of globalization. They just are offering a very different vision. And let me then move to the second question, although in reverse order, that here too, yes. Part of what I find intriguing about this is, again, in America, China is thought of as Xi Jinping, autocratic, it must be stopped. Actually, I mean, quite apart from the particular person in power right now, there is in China a flourishing debate on economic theory and building on indigenous economic theories that arose in China, arguing if those are rethought for the current order. It builds a very powerful, different vision than the kind of globalized vision of American neoliberal economics that has been just utterly, completely dominant in American economics departments and in American foreign policy and domestic policy since the 1990s. The view is we are developing, by building on indigenous economic theories from China, a better economic theory that they would want to be part of the global conversation. And I very much agree on an optimistic piece of this. This should be taken seriously globally. Not that I think any of us in this room would agree with all aspects of that, but no one in China in these debates agree with all aspects of it. It's a debate. But I think these ideas should be debated. We have had a global consensus since the 1990s about how to run an economy. We are seeing the radical reactions against it around the world. Some of them we may think are very illegitimate, but some of them are legitimate. And in China, there's a view that we have legitimate concerns about the extraordinary wealth inequality we've had to live with directly as a result of these policies. Let's rethink economic theory. And then, I will then conclude in reverse order. Yes, so I think if we do, as I've mentioned, the optimistic strain of this, as Gillian said, really start engaging with these counter theories that are absolutely in favor of globalization, but giving a very different vision from the consensus vision that's been so dominant since the 1990s, there is a possible way of building a dialogue, conversation, even possibly on specific issues like climate issues, et cetera, honest alliances with China. And I say this because, again, looking at America, the one policy that didn't change a bit from Trump to Biden is this view that China is just this autocratic regime that must be defeated, militarily defeated, economically defeated. It is absolutely the power that's, if anything, more dangerous than the Soviet Union was during the Cold War. And needless to say, if you're a superpower and developing an entire policy, an entire military aimed at China, China's going to respond by building a military that can stand up in response. So I think it's a very dangerous moment, but I do think, going back to the optimistic strain, there's a real possibility for an honest dialogue, and I'd like to say in American economics departments, and therefore American foreign policy and domestic policy, there are things we could learn from this conversation. It would honestly be a conversation from which we have much to learn. And if we do, then that would hopefully be a key way to avoid what otherwise honestly could be a coming war. Yes.
Tricia or Laurie, do you want to come in on any of these?
Just on that question of trade coordination and cooperation, because I think that was certainly a very big idea as Europe emerged out of the First World War, was first of all, the drive for national security. So Britain had been free trading, but actually found itself in the 19th century, though the world was globalizing, actually it wasn't really part of the big trade negotiations because it had nothing to kind of haggle with. But trade deals were a political process. They were not a legal one. So one of the challenges for the WTO is it's a hugely legal process and things can get caught up there. In the 1920s, it was understood to be a political process of negotiation. And ironically, in the 19th century, by the end of the 19th century, it was Germany in particular that seemed to be the kind of developing a new model of trade negotiation, which was all about hiking up tariffs and then negotiating them down. And this was actually how you built a globalized world economy. And Britain moved slightly to that position while also taking Germany's freedom to protect itself from it.
Yeah.
So I think that is important. And they were certainly in the 20s particularly preoccupied with this problem of actually people's legitimate right for protection because they'd had these large conscripted armies in the First World War and they'd promised people jobs, and a better world. And that globalization or raw globalization didn't, appear to bring that. I also just wanted to say a little bit about the turning points thing that historians often narrate 1919 and 1945 because we do that because it's a way of organising the narrative, but actually mostly historians then spend a lot of time destabilising that and say that it's economists who like to think it's a shock and an equilibrium, whereas for us, it's pretty messy most of the time. So that might be an optimistic way of seeing where we are.
Thank you. So very briefly, I just wanted to pick up 2 points about this idea of the world of ideas and how the kinds of discussions that have been initiated here can at least help illuminate some of the things that we're dealing with. So the first of these is one of the weirder things that came my way in 4 years in Moscow, against some pretty stiff competition, I have to say. And it was the spectacle of Vladimir Putin in an interview with the Financial Times
Not guilty.
declaring that the liberal idea had outlived its usefulness. Absolutely seminal moment,
Yes.
again, of Putin telling us what he really, really thinks. Of course he's pulling our chain. I mean, why wouldn't he? This is what he does the whole time, but it's also what he thinks. Quite often, it's because he's got something to hold on to. So, what I took that is if we disagree, we kind of need to demonstrate why he's wrong, don't we? And there is a fundamental point here, which we've all touched on in different ways, about trust. It's one of the really big things in Gillian's talk. So I'm very conflicted on this. One side of my brain says it's a terrible thing that we are losing trust in our institutions and our politicians and all the rest of it. We all work in universities. We live this stuff every day. If you're a politician, you certainly ought to be living it every day, and in the media, of course, particularly around the debates around public sector, public service broadcasting, and the responsibilities of the print media. But the other side of my brain says it's a really, really good thing that we no longer take people in authority on trust unless that trust is earned. So there's a really, I think, deep challenge for us in there. The second point is it's about the rules-based international order. So again, a Moscow anecdote. I've been told in terms on numerous occasions by Sergei Lavrov that the rules-based international order doesn't exist. We made it up, we the West. And as always with Russian propaganda, there's an element of truth in there. That's what they're holding on to. I'm saying this conscious of the fact that I have a former boss and a former UK permanent representative of the UN sitting in the front row. But one of the things that we may need to hoist on board is that what we understood as the rules-based international order is receding in the rearview mirror. That doesn't mean it's no longer of value, or the concept is no longer of value. I mean, because what we're talking about here is mechanisms and structures and habits for managing conflict and maximizing cooperation, depending on which game you're in. So a few weeks ago, I was in New York, coincidentally, during a General Assembly week. It was a pretty strange and dark week, but it started off with Guterres' Summit for the Future. So, I mean, no matter how strange some of those conversations and outputs were, it does kind of beg the question, if we didn't have it, what have we got? What would we need to put in its place?
Brilliant. So we'll try and squeeze in a couple of final questions. As we are quite short on time, I'll ask you to keep them short and to the point, and then we can get to answers. So there is one over there and one here as well.
My name is Marek Guszuk. I work for a financial institution. My first question is at Dr. Tett. Do you know from history any examples where a lot of resentment and anger in a white society have been decreased without a war or a revolution? And my second part of the question is, what's the role of kind of like Western soft cultural power that's focused on mass culture in diffusing like the resentment in places, like for example, like China, where historically there is justified resentment, and how much the Western culture can actually, what it can do to kind of like decrease it?
Great, thank you. Second question here.
Thanks very much. I'm Jonathan Boff. I'm from the University of Birmingham, so I'm quite used to gloom and pessimism. But I'm going to try and be a little bit more optimistic. I suppose my question would be, if we think of all these problems together at once, they seem insoluble. Russia, China, domestic populism, redistribution, all these sorts of... And of course they are connected in various ways, but aren't we in danger of sort of talking ourselves into a bit too much gloom by trying to find solutions to all of them all at once? You know, we have an urgent problem with Putin in Russia that has to be solved as soon as we possibly can. We have a longer-term problem with China, where it seems as if there may be some scope, and certainly from what you were saying earlier, some scope for building, where they have a stake in the status quo, in a way that Putin doesn't, I suppose, is the point I mean. And then thirdly, that the sort of domestic questions of disarming populism by redistribution and giving people who feel voiceless more of a say are sort of more structural problems that, again, we can deal with over time. So perhaps that's a more optimistic way to look forwards. Question mark.
Brilliant. Thank you. Gillian, I'll come to you first.
I was going to say, you know, if you have a population marred in resentment and anger, you know, there seems to me to be three ways you get out of it. Either through rapid growth, and everyone starts to feel better and like have a stake in the pie, which has been used on some occasions in the past. In many ways, post-World War II was part of that. Or you manage to have some form of redistribution and some form of, you know, internal change. Or you have an external war that unites everyone against it. Obviously, growth is the better desirable option. And there have been cases through history where economic growth managed to lessen the level of anger. I wanted to quickly come back to one thing. I won't address the issue of trying to do everything at once, but Laurie said, I think is incredibly important, which is that if I had to define one of the most important traits of what's happening around Donald Trump, which also echoes in many ways what's happened with Putin, it's a move away from a universal concept of law and rules and norms to situational law and ethics and norms. And I say that because I was with Bob Lighthizer, one of Trump's advisors, early this year at a meeting in Canada. And there was a great discussion about whether America was going to slap tariffs on the Canadians. And the Canadians said, well, hang on a sec, we're in the USMCA, what used to be NAFTA. You can't put tariffs on us, you know, maybe put tariffs on China, but not on us. To which the answer was, well, no trade deal is forever. Everything can be renegotiated. And it's essential that, because that's how you get leverage in discussions. And if you look at the unifying theme of the whole Trumpian movement, it really is about situational-based law and ethics. And that's really quite a stark shift from where we were in the late 20th century. And it's also quite a stark shift from the basis on which most capital market behavior happens today. So I just put it out there to pick up on Laurie's excellent comments about situational universal law.
Great. Laurie.
Yeah, so again, very briefly, I mean, maybe the first point to make is it's been hovering there throughout the evening. The question of what's different between now and 1919 or 1945. One of the things for me, it's both the enormous complexity, the velocity of change, and the scale of dilemmas that presents. And on top of that, the sort of multiple actors with agency that just didn't exist in those periods. So there's a degree of complexity there that I think is qualitatively as well as quantitatively different. Taking up the challenge of particularly soft power, maybe the right way to think about this is to try and do a bit of an audit of what we have that others want and invest in that. My sort of very, very quick jotting, drawing on the places I've worked for the last 3 decades or more, the rule of law. There are an awful lot of people who, even in the sort of strange places like Russia, they do their litigation if they want a seriously balanced outcome in the UK. They don't anymore because it's not available, but there's reason for that. I use the word, I hope advisedly, relatively competent and non-corrupt governance. That is not true in any country I have worked in outside the UK. That may tell you something about the countries I've worked in, but it's something to hold on to. The education system. Free media, relatively free media, but particularly public service broadcasting. Again, if you look at it from outside the UK, the role of the anthropologist, this is something that we have in the UK that not many countries have. And it's part of the fabric of who we are and what we have to offer. More broadly, the ability to innovate and in particular to regenerate. What is the biggest problem of all for the Kremlin? They have no idea how they're going to do a transition of leadership when the time comes, because there are no rules and no mechanisms to do that. We at least, I don't speak for the United States, we're going to see what happens in a couple of weeks, but we do have mechanisms and habits of the orderly transfer of power. And the last one, this is a really sort of problematic one, but I'll say it, just leave it hanging there, it's fairness. A concept of fairness that sits at the middle of our society and how at least it aspires to operate.
Absolutely.
I think you're absolutely right about the level of complexity, also that Jonathan's question from the audience. And of course, the other thing that's especially challenging is, and wasn't there in Keynes's world, is the sense that we have a strong sense that we live in a planetary system. We know it's there, but we also have 200 separate jurisdictions operating within it. So that's the extra dimension. But those challenges are, you're right, also running on different timelines, and they are often in different pots. I think one of the things that, and I'm not sure if this is a negative or a positive, we don't have to make everything like that, but we think of health in one category, economics in another category, society, and actually, in particular, when it comes to climate change and the way that that operates on very local ways and then goes all the way up into the planetary system, that will require us to think very carefully about the way that we've separated things out in a different order in the past. And the other thing that came into my mind was just when we were talking about, Gillian was talking about growth, it came too in the 50s with the kind of cult of domesticity, the kind of Higgy or whatever, that we kind of, it wasn't just that people had growth, but also that they treasured what they had at home, because the experience of what was outside the home was so awful because of the experience of the 30s and 40s. So maybe there's also something there about cherishing what we have in our immediate vicinity and our immediate locality, and that is a kind of protection from all of the turbulence that's around us.
Michael, I'll give you the final word.
Absolutely. And again, my deep thanks to both questions, which were outstanding. As before, I'll do a reverse order. Yes, I agree. If we divide these, and on the China side, hold back on our war footing, there is a longer-term real possibility of dialogue and, I think, honest cooperation on a number of trade issues. So I fully agree with, again, that key optimistic point. And let me then immediately turn to the resentment issue, which is absolutely huge in China. So to give you a bit of a background on this, but also returning to the optimistic strain, don't worry, part of the reason there's such resentment in China and such a claim that the neoliberal order from the 1990s, the so-called Washington Consensus, is a replication of the earlier British era of globalization under the British Empire. One of the examples that's commonly brought is, well, Britain would say, we support free global trade, and China needs to accept our free global trade because it creates an equal order for everyone. And what that meant in practice, of course, is Britain can dump opium into China. Britain can colonize a piece of China as the entryway into the dumping of opium. The argument is America doesn't take literal colonies, but it's doing a very comparable things. There is no equal playing field whatsoever. So when America keeps saying, we simply want to follow a global order of free trade, the argument is the entire system is set up such that it is devastating to countries like China and much of the world. And China's explicit argument is, and we think we're right to build a meritocratic state, to go back to classical Chinese theories where you would have a divorce between a meritocratic bureaucracy and moneyed interests, so you can gain wealth. There's actually strong support for gaining wealth in China, strong support for the market, but the argument is you should have a separate meritocratic bureaucratic system, and the two need to operate together as opposed to allowing the governance to be controlled by the market-based system. And to do that, you need a massive bureaucracy, you need a massive educational system. China's pouring money into the educational system. You need to do what governments can do and industry can't, build massive infrastructure projects. And the reason I'm mentioning all of this in terms of the resentment question is the view is, at least they claim, we're onto something here. like this works, it worked historically, it can work in a new form. Now it offers a real possibility for the world. It is, again, it is a global vision. It absolutely supports global trade, but it supports global trade while having a strong meritocratic state. And part of the resentment is to say, what happened under the British Empire, what's happening under the American Empire is we're not being taken seriously, we are being cannibalized, and we want a place at the table, and we think people should be at least willing to learn from us. And my view is we can't learn from this. We don't have to agree with all of it, but we absolutely have things to learn from. And if we can learn from it, I think it would be a better global order, because I think there are ideas here we should take seriously. And I think that would go an enormous way to breaking down the resentment, where you have entire swaths of the world who really think that this claim of free trade is, in fact, not an honest order where everyone has an equal say. So again, going back to the optimistic strain, I think there is a potential here for dialogue that would truly be extraordinary, that could honestly open up a better form of globalization. Yes.
Thank you very much.
What a lovely note to end on.
It's good to end on an optimistic note. I'm afraid this has brought to the end this section of tonight, but if you are in the room, please do join us outside to carry on the conversation with a few drinks. But before we do that, please do join me in thanking...
No, you finish off.
Just going to ask if we could thank Gillian and also the other speakers.
Super, thank you very much. Wow, what a 2 hours. Thank you very much. I hope you all enjoyed that. I certainly did. And the quality of debate, the contributions from the floor and from our panellists and our lecturer, absolutely superb. So thank you again. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Colm Lauder. I have the honour of currently chairing the Whitehall Group, the organisation which was founded 10 years ago by Douglas Blawston. And as obviously you saw, he's our chairman for the lecture series. And when that group was founded, it was founded to provide something a little bit different, to provide our alumni and our members and our supporters something very different from the normal run-of-the-mill alumni experiences, and certainly to avoid echo chambers. And as you can see from the debate and the engagement tonight, we very much succeeded in doing that. And that's thanks to the contributions of all our members, our supporters, our friends, our guests, our former speakers in achieving that. So thank you to you all for helping us over the last 10 years. I have a couple of special thanks, obviously. Gillian, an incredible 11th lecture. It's been a great honour to have you here and to have your support for this in preparation. It's really, really much appreciated. I think there's a lot of jaws dropped in the room with some of the views and the figures and the numbers there, and it was absolutely thoroughly interesting to chat through and to debate. To our panellists, Laurie, Patricia, Michael, thank you very much for joining us. Absolutely, really appreciate the time coming here, particularly travelling all the way from Harvard as well. Michael, very much appreciated. Gemma, our moderator, thank you, and thank you for hosting us here, and thank you to Lord Sainsbury as well for the wonderful offer of the Institute of Government rooms. We also want to make a few other thanks as well to our sponsors this evening, to our financial sponsors, which are Douglas Blawston, who you know, and to Dara Connell from Maitland Chambers. And thank you for their support, because it would not be possible without their contributions to running this event and the 11th of our lectures. To our members, which is, we always welcome new members. You're most welcome to inquire. Please ask Fiona, me, Douglas, or Anna if you are interested in our committee, and especially to thank Fiona Jones for putting all of this together, our Society Secretary. So thank you very much. And for those of you a little bit less familiar with what the Whitehall Group does, this is not our normal type of event. This is our showcase event on an annual basis. Our normal events are small, intimate, 10, 12 people with high-profile, engaging and interesting speakers discussing a whole wide range of topics. And again, we're always encouraging more people to get involved, new members, new activities. We host maybe 15 or so events a year, so please do reach out and inquire. But apart from that, please do join us next door for a drink, and thank you all for your time and support this evening. Thank you.